I'm so excited to welcome her to the stage. Shay, please.
Thanks for having me here today. Today, I feel really blessed. I run a company called Rising Woman, where we have thousands of women online, and a local sisterhood where we run a women's group. I just got engaged to my partner, Ben, sitting right here. And we facilitate conscious relationship workshops together, and we're going to be doing some festivals this year. But it wasn't always that way. In fact, when I was growing up, it was quite the opposite. I grew up without a father, and I was born to a 22-year-old mother who was an alcoholic, and she struggled with mental illness and depression. I remember when I was 2.5 years old, I would be left home alone for hours and hours every night where she would go out drinking. And she would come home and she would be so angry, and she would be punching walls and smashing things. And I remember sitting on the floor holding a picture frame that had been smashed and crying. And other nights she would come home and she'd be really sick. And I would brush her teeth and I'd put a blanket over her and she'd fall asleep on the bathroom floor. One night when I was 3, she picked me up and packed me in the car and we went for a drive. And when we got to a house, she took me out of the car and she placed me in the arms of strangers. And I just remember screaming and thrashing and begging her to come back. And she turned and she walked and she got in her car and she drove away. And little did I know that she was putting me in a foster home so that she could try to clean up and quit drinking so she could be there for me. But that was the moment that walls formed around my heart. That was the moment where a wound formed for me, what we're gonna later talk about, which is the abandonment wound. So I grew up feeling really unsafe. I had moments where I would go in and out of foster homes. I was typically known as the AWOL kid, which is just a term for foster kids that are always running away. And so I would receive birthday cards and Christmas cards from police officers who knew me by first name. I had my very own police officer, and she was sort of like an angel for me, actually. She really kept me out of trouble. I could have been in a lot more trouble. So as time went on, I used anger as a way to avoid my pain. And I learned that it was easier to be angry and to fight than it was to show my vulnerability, because I learned that that was weak. And I really learned to fight to survive in the world. So nobody would ever know if they had hurt me. Nobody would ever know if my feelings were hurt. And I would be in deep denial of that at any cost. I would just shut down or get angry and run away. That was my default, just run away from everyone. So as time went on, I went through a series of not so great relationships, and then I landed in one when I turned 19 that was very abusive. When we first met, he was kind of everything that I thought, I wanted. Oh, he was super attractive, he seemed like he had his shit together, he was fun, and we had chemistry. And so we moved really fast, and I moved in with him, and then it turned violent. The relationship got so abusive that I could have been killed. But he was a perfect match for me at that point, because I had so much unexpressed anger inside of me, so much unexpressed anger, that he was the perfect match for me to bring that out. And so our fights reflected that. And I remember this one moment looking back at my reflection. I was standing in the bathroom, and I had a bruised face, and my face was swollen, and I could hardly recognize myself. And all of a sudden, I had this feeling, and this little voice came on. And it said, Sheleana, you're gonna be speaking about this on stage one day. You're meant to work with women, and this is part of your learning. And I actually had the audacity to share that with him. We were driving in the car, and I said, I had this vision the other day that I'm gonna be talking on stage to women about how to overcome abusive relationships. And I think you should get help, because this is part of my purpose. And I don't know, he just looked at me and was like, yeah, okay. And so from that point on, I knew that I needed to do more with these lessons that were coming my way, but I wasn't quite ready. And I did leave that relationship, and I went on to find myself. But I sort of skipped doing what we call shadow work, and I went straight for the love and light. So I went for the law of attraction and the secret, and looking at crystal healing, and just observing my mind, and looking at my thoughts, and being positive. And I did a year of celibacy, and then I decided that, I had just overcome everything. I never really dove deep into the wound, but I felt like I had done my work. And then I met another man, or boy, we were 21, so who knows at that point, right? And he was different. He was kind, he was loving, he wasn't abusive, but we just didn't have that type of relationship that felt like an adult relationship. It was kind of like being in a relationship with a brother or maybe a son. Like I felt like I was often a mother. There was a codependency to it. And resentment built really quickly in that relationship. Even though we stayed together for 5 years, we were not on each other's team. And a lot of fights occurred and a lot of separation occurred. And in the end, our egos won. In the end, he ended up falling in love with somebody else, and we had a big explosive fight. And then one day, he came home in the summer, and he packed his things. And I remember chasing him outside in bare feet, and he got in the car with her, and he drove away. And in that moment, panic just washed over my body. I was freaking out. I was so terrified. And all of a sudden, I started having this flash of when I was 3. And I saw myself like reaching for my mom, and I was like, whoa, what is going on here? This isn't me. Oh, this is deeply me. This has nothing to do with him. And so, even though for the months leading up to him actually leaving our home, I had been sort of desperate to make things work and fix things, in that moment, even though I was terrified and felt helpless, I also felt this relief wash over me. All of a sudden, I was like, oh, I don't need him to come back. I don't need him to do anything, say anything, or be anything for me to be okay. I can get through this because this is an inside job. And I realized in that moment that it was really about healing my own wounds that I had left unattended for so long. But my story isn't unique. If you look to the person next to you, or if you just take a look around at all, we all have a story. We all have wounds, some that we've tended to and some that we have pushed aside. Our culture doesn't really respect trauma, and we have this sort of category for trauma, and we have our idea of what it is. But an abandonment wound can be as simple as having an emotionally unavailable parent, or having parents who had divorced, right? It doesn't always look like my story, and sometimes it's far worse, right? There's a spectrum. But what happens in our culture and in our society is that we learn to push our pain aside. We learn to sweep it under the rug and not really care about it, or think that the way to get over it is just to move on. And so then we get into relationships that cause us to move into the wound, but we're behaving unconsciously because we don't really realize that it's not about the person, it's about the pattern, right? And so this is how the abandonment wound can play out. Sometimes it will happen so that we are in a relationship with somebody and we find ourselves pushing them away, wanting to keep them at a distance. We might be the person who ghosts. We might be the person who always waits for the other shoe to drop, so we're the one to leave before we can ever be left. One of the ways that I play it out, even in my partnership with my fiance, is that when we have a fight, I assume that it's going to be over. And he's always like, what? This is a fight, you're allowed to do that. But I'm like, it's over, everything is terrible. And so my mind will just go there because I catastrophize things, right? And raise your hand if you can relate to that in relationship, right? And raise your hand if you tend to kind of shut down and maybe run the other direction instead of having to deal with that crazy person that you're in a relationship with, right? Notice how there's half and half, and that's how we connect in relationship. So we go out into the world looking for somebody to complete us, looking for that perfect one, but what happens is we're actually attracting somebody who's a perfect match for our wounds, somebody who's going to mirror back the unfinished business from our past in an attempt to heal it. There's a great book called Getting the Love You Want by Harville Hendricks, and I usually recommend it to all of my clients because it's such a great example of seeing how whatever relationship we're in has healing for us. There's medicine there for us. And so we get into this relationship with this person in the honeymoon phase when we think that they're the one to make it all better. We're constantly looking for something outside of ourselves to fix the problem. But what's really happening is that we're projecting that out instead of taking ownership of what's going on inside. And there's a saying that, you know, from a distance they look like diamonds and rubies. The closer you get, they're tears and blood. What that really means is that when we're in the honeymoon phase, we're just going through the motions. We see somebody who we think is the person for us, they're different than all the rest. The problem was really those other losers, and this guy's gonna be the best, or this woman's gonna be the best. They're gonna fix it. But then the closer that we get, we start to say, oh, crap, why is this happening again? Why does this problem keep coming back? I thought that I was over that, or what's going on? I thought that this relationship was gonna be better. And so we start to realize that we are in relationship with a pattern, right? So when we get to this point where the relationship begins to become serious or has potential to be serious, sometimes I relate it to, you know, two egos coming out to battle. So all of a sudden our wounds might be activated. Any fears that we have of getting too close, any insecurities or self-doubt that we might have, that will come out. And what happens is we go into the power struggle phase, and if we do this unconsciously, if we're not aware of what's happening, we can just end up in this really long battle with the person that we're with, and we can just fight each other constantly, needing to be right. And it's all just a game. It's all just a game that our egos play to keep us separate so that we're not seen, right? And so that's why we talk about doing shadow work. Shadow work is looking at the darker parts of our nature, looking at the parts of ourselves that we feel are unlovable, and revealing those. And when we do that, we can move into a space of sacred relationship. But we can't move into that space when we're fighting each other and when we're not acknowledging what's left to be felt. So when I talk about conscious relationship, sometimes we think like, well, conscious relationship, what is that even? Is that about finding the right person and then we can like create a conscious relationship? But really it's about our relationship with ourselves first. If we want to be in right relationship with somebody else, we have to be in right relationship with ourselves. And so for me, that looked like diving deep into my own wound, acknowledging the ways that I was scared, acknowledging the ways that I was afraid to be left, acknowledging the ways that I was afraid to be vulnerable. And we all play these out in relationships in our own ways. And so the first step to actually being in right relationship with another person is to be honest about that, right? So we have to go through the power struggle at some point. It's just part of the process. Getting into relationship, having our fears come out. And a lot of times, you know, we fight and then we break up and we move on to another person, swapping out one person for the next, just on the continual search. But at some point, if we get bored of that, we can say, okay, I actually want to do something different here. And that's what my partner Ben and I decided to do. We sat down and we said, okay, let's create a conscious relationship here. Let's work through it. And that doesn't mean that we don't have stuff come up. So, you know, when we first got together, our fights would look like getting upset about something stupid or something that was supposed to be serious but really wasn't. And he would kind of shut down and move away. And I would, of course, get anxious and we need to talk about it and fix it right now. And when he didn't give me what I wanted, I would get upset and I would blame him for not doing what he was supposed to do. Or I would say that he wasn't being conscious in our relationship because he wasn't giving me what I needed. But the truth is that what he was giving me was really good medicine because I finally got the message. It wasn't so much a problem that he was shutting down, it was the way that I was responding. And it was the story that I was making up about the way that our fights were happening. So my story was that he wasn't behaving the way that I needed him to, and therefore he was wrong and I was still right. It wasn't getting me anywhere. But what I actually realized was that he was constantly giving me this opportunity to learn how to soothe myself. He was giving me an opportunity to take my wound, go sit with it, and just let myself feel. How often do we actually just let ourselves feel what's coming through without distraction? There are so many distractions. We find all sorts of things. Alcohol, using cannabis, going on our phones, even sometimes exercising, which can be a healthy outlet, but can also be one of the ways that we just try to drown out our feeling, we try to numb ourselves out. And so what I found is that the more that I was just soothing myself and being with my wound and taking the pressure off of him, the more he would lean into me. And when we would sit down and have a talk about it, it would go two ways. Either the blame game, I would blame him for not responding the way that I needed him to respond, didn't go anywhere, we just end up back where we started. Or we'd kind of drop my walls a little bit, put down my sword and say, when you leave, I feel afraid. When you leave, I feel like I'm not good enough for you. Sometimes I feel scared that you're gonna leave. And it reminds me of when I was a little girl, and anytime I was upset and needed to be heard, my mom would give me away or lock me out, right? Really easy for him to lean into me and to love me in those moments because I was taking ownership. And that's what sacred relationship is really about. So codependent relationship is two people taking from each other like batteries, feeding off of each other, asking each other to behave a certain way, and when they don't, everything goes to hell. And then the other way is when there's both of us and the garden. We're feeding the garden, and then the garden is feeding us. And a really healthy relationship, both of us are responsible for our own feelings and our own needs and expressing them. Stuff still comes up, but we work through it from a mature place. And it's meant to feed us so that we can go out into the world and live our purpose. We are not here to make each other feel anything. We are simply here to just hold space for each other as whole and complete as we already are. And for us to actually get to that place and to realize that place, we don't need to go off and sit on top of a mountain and meditate. We don't need to be perfect before we find that person. We just need to be willing. We just need to be willing to be vulnerable and to lean in a little bit, to take ownership, to just take a breath. In the moments where we're not sure what we're feeling, take a breath and just feel. And so I would invite you to explore if there's anything in your life that you have been sweeping under the rug. If there's anything in your past that you haven't given permission to exist and to have space inside of you. And that really is the essence of being in conscious relationship. It's about self-acceptance. It's not about changing who we are. It's not about extracting things. It's simply about learning how to accept ourselves for who we are.